Hi, in this class we're going to learn about the 5 books of poetry, or sometimes they're called the wisdom books in the Old Testament. But before we go into the specific books, I want to give you an overview of the Bible up to this point, and then an overview of those 5 books, and then we're going to dive into the books one at a time. So the Old Testament is divided into 4 parts. We have the books of the law, which is the book of Genesis to Deuteronomy, and then we have the historical books, which is the book of Joshua, all the way to the book of Esther. And then we have the wisdom or poetical books, which is the book of Job, all the way to Songs of Solomon. And then we have also the prophets. And the prophets are divided into major prophets and minor prophets. Now, don't confuse the major and the minor. The major and the minor is not how big the prophet is, but really is the size of the book. So, for example, Jeremiah or Isaiah is not bigger than Hosea or Obadiah. It's just that Isaiah is a bigger book than the book of Hosea. So the 5 major prophets are extremely large books, and the 12 minor prophets are smaller books. So that is why it is called the major prophet and the minor prophet. Not by the size of the prophet, but by the size of the book, or the size of the prophet's anointing, but by the size of the book itself. Now, so the major prophets, we have 5 books of the major prophets, and even within the 5 major prophets, there is 2 divisions: pre-exilic prophets and exilic prophets. So pre-exilic prophets are the prophets that prophesied before the people of Israel went into exile, and then the the exilic prophets are the ones that prophesied when they were in exile. So the pre-exilic prophets prophesied before the people of God went into exile, and then the exilic prophet prophesied when the people of God were already in exile. And the 3 pre-exilic books are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Lamentation. And then the exilic prophets, books of the prophets, is Ezekiel and Daniel. And then in the minor prophets, we have the 12 books from Hosea to Malachi. And also we have the pre-exilic prophets and post-exilic prophets of the minor prophets. So the pre-exilic prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Those are the 9 pre-exilic prophets under the minor prophets. And then the last minor prophets, the last 3 is Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And those are prophets that prophesied after the people of God had come back from exile. So that's why it is post-exilic. So pre-exilic before exile, exilic in exile, and post-exilic after exile. I hope that makes sense. Having looked at the structure of the Old Testament, let's jump into the wisdom books. And we have 5 of these wisdom books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and also Songs of Solomon. Now, the book of Job deals with the problem of suffering, answering the question, why do bad things happen to good people? The book of Psalms records personal and corporate songs and prayers offered to God by the nation of Israel. And in the book of Psalms, it answers the question, how should I approach God? And I like the book of Psalms because there is a lot of emotions, because God created us with emotions. And when you look at the book of Psalms, there's a lot of emotional outbursts as people are dealing with the problem of suffering, sorrow, depression, joy, praise. And you see all this range of emotions as people are praising God and singing to Him, depending on what part of life they're in. And then the book of Proverbs deals with the problem of conduct or behavior, answering the question, how shall I live? Ecclesiastes deals with the problem of the meaning of life. It answers the question, why am I here? And you're going to see in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, having lived his whole life and experienced everything that there is in life, concludes with this refrain, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And then you have the book of Songs of Solomon, which deals with the issue of love, answering the question, how shall I love? And you're going to see here the marital love. And there's an interesting connection between the book of Proverbs and the book of Songs of Solomon. The books of Proverbs is it warns about sexual immorality, the idea of having sex outside of the confines of marriage, where God intended for it to be enjoyed. And in the books of Songs of Solomon, it's kind of like a license of enjoyment of this intimate relationship with your wife or husband in the context of marriage. And the book of Solomon, Songs of Solomon, is going to expand into that. Now, Psalms, Proverbs, and Songs of Solomon are written entirely in Hebrew poetry. Now, Job is all poetry except its beginning, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and also the ending in chapter 42, verse 7 to 17. Ecclesiastes kind of jumps back and forth between poetry and wisdom literature. So as you're reading these books, it's important to understand what the authors are doing with poetry and the wisdom literature, kind of jumping back and forth or staying with it. It is also important to understand that Hebrew poetry does not rhyme sounds. It does rhyme images, thoughts, and concepts through the use of Hebrew parallelism. Now, we are used, like when you listen to a song or a poet in the modern world, they try to rhyme words. And I remember when I was a teenager, we used to go to camp, and there was this girl called Lorraine, and we kind of formed a poem for her, kind of to tease her, but also just to make her feel special. Well, it wasn't really to make her feel special because the poem wasn't making her feel special, but we were trying to rhyme words. Her name was Lorraine. So we'll say, Lorraine, a terrible pain in the brain. Lorraine, you're driving me insane. So they're trying to kind of rhyme those words, Lorraine with rain, insane, pain, and all those things. And it's just kind of like rhyming the words. Now, Hebrew parallelism or Hebrew poetry does not rhyme words according to sound, but it rhymes words according to images, thoughts, and concepts. And it does this through the use of Hebrew parallelism. So this is when two or more lines of a Hebrew poem corresponds very closely with the next line or with one another in order to make a point. So if they want to make a point, they use two lines. Either the first line will emphasize the second line, or the first line will contrast the second line, or the first line will expound on the second line. And whenever the first line kind of says the same thing as the second line, this is known as synonymous parallelism, where the same thing is said in different ways to convey a teaching. For example, in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 1, why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? So you have a nation raging here, but then the idea of raging is being explained against so that you can really get it. They're doing this by the people plotting in vain. And then the second example of parallelism is antithetic parallelism, or contrasting the first line and the second line. It is also known as contrastive parallelism, which uses a contrast between two or more lines to teach us truth. For example, in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. So you see here, you have the idea of the wise son being contrasted with the foolish son, and the wise son makes the father happy, but the foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. So it's contrasting one line to the other. So that's what is called as antithetic parallelism. And then you have the final one is synthetic parallelism, or sometimes also called developmental parallelism, which synthesizes two or more poetic lines. And in such parallelism, successive lines build on, expands, or intensifies the first line. For example, Proverbs chapter 25 verse 5, "For you are the God of salvation. For you I wait all day long." And it kind of like expands and synthesizes and intensifies the first line. My favorite example of synthetic parallelism is Proverbs 6, chapter 16 to 19. And you can go and read that. It's the one that says there is this many sins that God hates, or these many things that God hates, and then it lines them out and just kind of expounds into them. Now, why is this important? This is important because understanding how different biblical writings are working or work really helps us to avoid misinterpretation. So the way that you preach the book of Proverbs or Psalms or Ecclesiastes is not the way that you're gonna preach the book of let's say Genesis, because Genesis really, those are narratives, they're stories, but these are poems. So this really helps us to improve our ability of finding the wisdom that God really wants us to get in these books of wisdom and poetry.